It is such an honor to have Raghuram Rajan on the podcast with us today. Raghu, it's such an honor to meet you, and I'm really excited to be discussing your new book, but also just discussing your perspective on where we stand as an economy and a society. So thanks for taking the time to join us.
Thanks for having me.
So you have such a impressive list of accolades, and I was kind of compelled to ask you about just where did your kind of drive to pursue the career path that you're on right now come from? What were maybe some of the defining events in your life that impacted the way that you currently see it?
Well, I guess different people have different views on where you are. To some extent, where I have really contributed has been in the area of both economic theorizing and research, as well as economic policy making. And if you look for beginnings, I would say it comes from growing up in a poor country and asking, why on earth are we so poor? What is it that we're doing which keeps us this way? Because I had been to other countries that were much richer, and trying to figure out what the difference was. And it certainly wasn't the caliber of the people. And so it seemed to be something else that was making a difference. And to that extent, that was in many ways the motivating force behind getting into economics.
Yeah, my wife is from a third world country, and I think that when you live in certain circumstances, again, this is me not speaking from experience, but you tend to just accept the circumstances as they are. But once you see the contrast, that's when I think those questions begin. So maybe what are some of the conclusions general conclusions you came to that answered as an answer to that question?
Well, it's an evolving process. As you know, there's this famous, I don't know who said it, but the questions always remain the same. The answers change. So I've seen the answers change to this very question: why are we so poor? I've seen the answers change over my lifetime. I today have a somewhat different set of answers than I would have had, as a 20-year-old. As a young person, you think it's all about some people having appropriated all the fruits, and that's part of the answer. But it doesn't explain why they need to keep it for themselves, why there aren't more opportunities for everyone else. And in fact, the easy answer at that point is, let's tax the rich, let's spread it all around, and things will be fine. And then you realize that the answer is a little more complicated, and you have to figure out how, in fact, you create opportunities for everybody. And that's to my mind the real question. How in every country do we create the possibility for everybody to reach their limits? And that means first creating the capabilities in people. We're not born as fully fledged adults with a PhD degree. We sort of acquire all of this on the way. So how do we create the environment? That's where my new book on the community, how do we create the environment that enables you to get to that place? But then once you have those capabilities, how does the system create incentives for you to use them in the best way possible? How does it make sure that some people don't appropriate most of the fruits and it's more widely spread? How do we keep a level playing field both at the beginning but also along the way? That seems to me the systemic questions we have to answer. And it's not clear to me that as I grow older, that it's a menu where we pick pieces from the menu. I like this, I like that. To me, it seems more like an equilibrium where a bunch of things happen together, and you have to make compromises. I like this and I like that. I don't like something else, but that's part of the reason, or that's how you enjoy the things that you enjoy. You have to give up some other things for that.
Well, I want to talk about some of your past and some of the experiences that you've had over the last 12 years. Specifically in the positions you've been in, positions of authority and influence. But let's dive quickly into this third pillar, the book that you just came out with, because I think they all tie together. So would you mind just explaining first what the pillars are, and then specifically what that third pillar is and why you decided to focus the book around that pillar?
Right. I mean, to some extent, I was looking at what I thought was possibly the most successful wealth creating system we've had in history, which was the post war liberal market society. Now, that has three words: liberal, market, and actually, I would say democracy is probably the third word. Liberal means a state which allows people to flourish, a state which is limited but does what it's supposed to do, maintain law and order and so on. So that's the liberal part. The market is pretty well understood. That is, to my mind, the second pillar, first being the state. And then there's society, there's community working through democracy to essentially keep the system free and fair and open to everyone. So the third pillar, in my view, is community, but it also implies democracy. It also implies a broader society which essentially works together. So when you have these, I think you have the conditions for success as a society. To my mind, and this is where I said you can't pick pieces of this menu. Some people want democracy, but they don't want markets. Some people want government and democracy, but again, they don't want markets. To my mind, the three hold together. And the first part of the book is trying to tell you why the three fit together. For example, an independent private sector flourishing in a competitive market is important because it acts as an independent source of power. It balances the mighty power of the state. And that balance is important. Otherwise, an overweening state has a tendency of becoming authoritarian. No matter what democratic structures you have, the state which is unbalanced by other parts. I mean, look around the world. When you see a Turkey led by an Erdogan who has very few constraints on his authority, you understand the private sector in Turkey is not much of a restraint. And understandably so, because the state controls so many levers over the private sector, whether it is its ability to take away credit, its ability to refuse permissions here and there. You need a more open, flourishing, competitive market where you can have the likes of the New York Times or the Washington Post holding the administration in check, or you can have a Fox News holding the previous administration in check. You need these independent private sector powers. I'm not saying it's ideal in the United States. I'm just saying that the private sector is more independent than in other countries.
So I think it's your perspective is interesting, but I also believe it may not be the perspective that's held by everyone. I mean, that you have enjoyed a seat at seeing the world from so many different places. And I look at those that are, in the community and how they're viewing the challenges and the imbalance, because I think most would agree that there's imbalance. But when it comes to the environment, what I understand as the best environment and what you understand, and then what a person that's had, maybe no experience leaving, central Indiana or central Florida or wherever, just having a very limited perspective on things, they would want the same thing in the end, but yet they're all, I would say, disagreeing on the environment, because that's where you come in with, a lot of what, AOC and Bernie Sanders and, this notion of communism, which is community, right? That it kind of comes to that third pillar. So how has your experience over the years really shaped the perspective and how strong you feel about a specific type of environment to allow this third pillar to essentially be as influential as the other two pillars.
Well, I think it's not just sort of my feelings. I mean, what is clear, even in the United States, which is a country which, by many by many counts, doesn't really emphasize the community anymore.
Yeah.
Even today, you find that the community really matters. Some very powerful work by Raj Chetty, an economist at Stanford, now at Harvard, shows that which community you grow up in essentially determines what your income will be for the rest of your life. Mm-hmm. And he does this by looking at kids that move between communities. So you move from a community which is low down on the performance scale to a community which is much higher up in the performance scale. It makes a world of difference in your life chances. Mm-hmm. So community matters, even in the United States, and where some people would argue the community is de-emphasized. But it matters. Why? Because it provides you that starting, it gets you that start in terms of your early education, the early schooling you go to, the values you espouse, your identity, your sense of who you are, and your ambitions, right? The ambitions you talked about, some places in rural Indiana, the ambitions of kids there today, and I've talked to a bunch of them, are quite different from the ambitions of kids in New York City. And so in that sense, it does matter. And it does set how well you will do going forward in your life. Now, how well you will do income-wise is not the same thing as how well you will do happiness-wise. There's obviously differences between the two. But in general, if we want capitalism to work, people, wherever they are in the country, should have the feeling that it works reasonably well for them, that they're not doomed right from the beginning because of where they started. And that's really our challenge today, because the requirements for participating in the capitalist economy have been increasing because of technological change. The skills you require today are far higher than the skills a kid required 100 years ago. A high school education no longer cuts it. So how do you get the skills that you need in the communities you're growing up in? We can't bring everybody to San Francisco and New York City. You have to have much more sort of community-centered development. The problem is that it's a vicious circle. When economic activity leaves a community, the big employer in town closes down, what follows is everything else starts breaking down. Your social relationships start breaking down, marriages break down, more divorces, more teenage pregnancies, more drug use. Your schools start breaking down. And then you have really a much lower chance of succeeding in the economy, not just you, your kids. And so it's a vicious circle. How do we break that vicious circle? We've had many areas like this in the country in the past, but they're increasing. And the question is, how do we reverse this process? And the answer is not lower interest rates. Got it. Similarly, it doesn't mean just have more fiscal spending. It typically means much more targeted, often bottom-up processes by which we rebuild activity in a community, bring more sort of jobs, new employers, new skills. And that means community involvement. It also means outside support. But we need to be much more clever about this than we've been so far.
Maybe go through some of the research that you went through to prove out or to support your thesis, because the world is rapidly evolving, and you make certain claims regarding how the things of life are becoming so much easier, whether it's the food we have or transportation or entertainment. It's unprecedented as you compare it to 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago. So in individuals, I believe that especially in my experience, in individuals, fulfillment and their experience, their positive experience of life is being involved in making a difference and contributing in a sense. So how have you? What research or what things did you do to support some of the methods and direction of strengthening this third pillar?
Well, I think the phenomenon I'm pointing to are sort of meta-level phenomenon. And so you point to a number of studies which point in the same direction, but the job of somebody writing a book like this is to tie it all together and to say, here's the big picture. And the big picture can be summarized in one big causal factor and one pillar which is weak and therefore cannot respond. The causal factor is technological change, which, as you just said, is making such a huge impact in our life. And typically, in previous environments of strong technological change, the industrial revolutions, for example, society responded in a big way and said, here are the things that are being touched by technology. Here's how we should respond. For example, in the second industrial revolution, when you had big auto factories, chemical factories being set up, in the United States, you had a massive high school movement, which created a large number of high schools, but also made high school education free so that kids could go and get that education. Now, what is interesting is there was also a time of a lot of immigration. But the immigrants who came into the United States were not well schooled. They were experienced carpenters, they were experienced plumbers. They had experience, but they didn't have schooling. They were not appropriate for the factories where you needed to know trigonometry to set the angles right in a machine. That the kids that had gone through high school knew how to do it. And that's how America sort of dealt with the second industrial revolution, and many Americans benefited from that. And I would argue that we need to figure out what the appropriate response this time is also, because what you see is because of technological change, the easy jobs in the middle, the ones that required, even a high school education, that was the technological revolution of the past, and you could actually get decent incomes with that kind of education. Those jobs are disappearing. The manufacturing jobs, which were well-paid, unionized jobs, even the jobs and services, the job of a clerk who used to have to know how accounting, have to know how to add and subtract and so on, used to fill large ledgers. I mean, that job doesn't exist. It's been automated. Yeah. So these jobs in the middle have gone, and you're really left with a choice of either the low-skilled job, you're a security guard somewhere, or the high-skilled job, you're a consultant at McKinsey. In between, the ladder is first a long ladder, but is also not many people on that ladder because the in-between jobs have gone. How do we position people now for those jobs higher up on the ladder? How do we position them with stronger skills? That has become the central question. And the problem is, it all starts with the community. My colleague Jim Heckman at the University of Chicago, who's a Nobel laureate in economics, says by the time you're 5 years old, you're basically done for life in terms of your trajectory, because you've had the early childhood health supports that you need to keep you healthy through life. You've learned some of your habits. Your vocabulary is very different depending on whether you grew up in a professional household or in a household which is really poor, where parents don't talk that much. Sometimes there is a strong correlation between income levels and how much you can afford to have time to prepare your kids. And therefore, their life chances of that kid, even by age 5, are very different, depending on how they grew up. And so in this world where it matters, for you to get those good jobs, you have to have that early preparation. You have to go through a decent high school to be able to manage in college. It's not just enough that colleges open their doors to you. You can spend 6 years and drop out. One of the biggest problems in US education is the high dropout rate from college. And these kids drop out with huge debt. Part of the problem is they're not well prepared for college in the first place. So how do we get them that preparation? It starts with the community. And that's why I say we need to repair our communities first in order to have a chance in this technological revolution.
So what are some of the ideas that you're proposing, or some of the ideas that may in fact move the needle? Because it is quite the undertaking, right? Because I know that one of your areas of expertise is behavioral science, and how human beings behave in large part is habitual or subconscious. And that's where, as you're making claims of, where we derive our, our vocabulary, where do we derive our opinions of certain things. It's not like you snap a finger and make an argument and suddenly people just, have a different way of viewing the world. So from a community standpoint, making that shift, like what are some of the ways that you see a community, at least the majority of a community, seeing things differently and making the subsequent change?
It's a great point you make, because it's something that can't happen from the outside. Somebody clicking their fingers outside and, hey, you community, you got to pull yourself up.
Yeah.
What you see again and again is it comes from inside, and so you have to maximize the chances of it coming from inside, but you can't force it from the outside. And often it's a few people getting together. In the book, I talk about the Pilsen community in Chicago, which basically was crime-ridden. It was a war zone, literally. The number of deaths per 100,000 was approaching the deaths in Germany during the height of World War II. There were drug wars in every part of the strip there. And essentially, as one of the community activists told me, change came when they found a body outside the church, one of the 6 churches, and said, this can't go on anymore. The pastor basically asked, who amongst you is willing to stand up? Who amongst you is willing to take the first step? And a bunch of young men came together. And one of them essentially volunteered to take on the task of community revival. And their first task was essentially fixing the crime, bringing down the crime, because with that level of crime, no employer wanted to come in. And they did all sorts of interesting things to arrest the crime. For example, they found that much of the crime was localized around a few bars. So they petitioned the city of Chicago to close down those bars in the neighborhood. And then they found that, one of the problems was people didn't want to call when they saw crime, because they feared the criminals would go after them. Why are you ratting on us? So they essentially got a whole bunch of people to call at the same time, to call the police at the same time and say, look, there's a crime here in progress. And they also persuaded them, get out of your houses. Crime flourishes in dark spaces. Get out, light it up, and come out and crowd the criminals out. It was community effort, which essentially brought down some of the crime. Then they did things like saving the local bank, which was going out of business. But this combination of things essentially helped them essentially become more attractive. And, to some extent, they're paying sort of a modest price for that, as now a whole lot of businesses are coming in, a whole lot of people from outside want to live in the Pilsen neighborhood because it seems so much more attractive. So they are getting a little bit of gentrification. I think that's not entirely a bad thing. There are some bad aspects to it in forcing some old-time residents out, but they are going in the right direction, so to speak. So, sorry.
I was gonna, yeah. I mean, it's a perfect example. At the same time, you look at the root cause or event of that happening, and it was a dead body in front of a church. And so have you found in just your an analysis of things that typically you have these events that happen, like these earthquakes that shake a person and make them realize, wow, the pain of staying the same is actually worse than the pain of changing and making changes. And you see that as a fundamental dynamic as far as how communities make the changes and adjustments that will strengthen their core and that pillar.
Well, it's a very good question. I'm not sure that you need every community needs to have that wake up moment. Some will, and whether it's drug abuse or crime or just the largest employers shutting down, there will be different triggers for them to see that, okay, the things can't go on this way. We have to change. There's a very nice book, Janesville, on how the big employer in town, GM, shut down in a Wisconsin town, and how the community came together. Now she leaves it where the community is trying to put things back together, but is not successful thus far. But since then, Janesville seems to have made some progress, and things are a lot better than they were. In fact, to the extent that the community police is now issuing parking tickets. That's a sign of development, that actually you have so much traffic that parking tickets are being issued. But more broadly, I would say the reason I emphasize Pilsen is I want to say that communities that are far down and are plagued by poverty, drug abuse, and crime have found ways to lift themselves. I see this every day in poor India, that there are villages that decide, okay, we're not going to depend on the elusive government coming in and digging irrigation tanks and irrigation ditches for us. We're going to do it. It's that old frontier mentality in the US, right? That we're going to do it because there's nobody else who's going to do it for us. Now, that is a mentality, but I think in a developed country, there's so many sources of help also. I've been talking, for example, to the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, where they have an entire department which is trying to energize some of these community efforts, bringing communities together, getting them to learn from each other. And there are, of course, many sources. There's a lot of wealth in this country, and that wealth is sometimes in private philanthropic ways. For example, the Kaiser Foundation in Tulsa, or in public ways. We have now something called the Opportunity Zone set up by this administration, which essentially offers tax benefits if you invest in communities that are falling behind. So there is help available, but I think it's very hard for Washington or for some faraway capital, state capital, to understand what needs to be done in the community. So the planning on what needs to be done has to become much more internal. Who would know that the significant problem in Pilsen was crime? That once you dealt with the crime, other magic would happen. So it's trying to figure out what are the 2 or 3 key impediments that if I fix, it will set it back on a virtuous cycle and reverse the vicious cycle. That locals know far better. There's so many examples, some of which I cite in the book, but elsewhere, of people thinking, okay, what can we do that's different? What can we do to get the community engaged? And there will be mistakes, there will be failures, but it's a way out. And it's a way out which I think is easier in a developed country, where really the key is attaching yourself back to the national economy.
Well, I find these are fascinating points. It's something I think about a lot. I know that there are many others that are asking similar questions as to how is this wealth gap going to end up, because it's moving, but is it moving in the right direction? And that's where you have the primary narratives I think that exist are that the federal government is really the power of influence that should be fixing this problem, and and it continues to build. I think there's a lot of movement right now, especially with the liberal side of things, the Democratic, a large part of the Democratic Party, where the solution isn't necessarily going back to communities. The solution is using central powers to influence change through universal basic income or redistribution of wealth. And and I look at how significant the claims you're making, and you're really trying to solve symptoms with those central influenced initiatives, instead of the actual root of the issue, because the world is evolving. Like, you were mentioning 5-year-olds. My 5-year-old, I have a 5-year-old that turned 5 today, and just to see what the world has done in the last 5 years is incredible. And you look at the central powers, and being able to, it's just not reasonable for them to adapt to the rate of change that's occurring, because they're so far away, and by the time a decision needs to be made, it's too late. So I look at, the significance of, your perspective and what you're making claims on as something that, would move the needle. And I think local, that was the intention of the United States in the beginning, wasn't it? And the reason for the 10th Amendment, right, is to keep, powers more local than federal. But anyway, I mean, there's so many like other questions I have as a follow up to this. But I'd love to just, see how you have looked at the state of, the United States, the state of the world when it comes to the immense amount of government power that exists and their kind of adoption of this role to solve problems and to make everything right. Do you see? I mean, you mentioned that the Federal Reserve or the bank, Federal Reserve Bank in Philadelphia, but do you see other signs of just how this central influence is shrinking, or do you see that there's still issues to be resolved there?
Well, look, I don't want to argue, I mean, to your earlier point, that there is no role for the central government. But it seems to me that for 45, 50, well, I think since Gerald Ford, every president has been the education president. And how we're doing on education? Not very well. So we need to figure out alternative approaches. And I would agree very much with your thinking that central is difficult because the problem that each place faces is so different. And so some one-size-fits-all policy devised in Washington is not going to work. As support, central is fine. As prime mover, it's probably not what the doctor ordered for the country. And I think this chimes very well with the resilience and the the empowerment of people, which has always been true in the United States. And I worry that in these communities, that empowerment is fading, that sense of empowerment. And that also leads to a different kind of problem, which is that you look to the nation for your identity and for your answers, rather than for the people around you. And my worry, and that's true in a number of countries now, it's true in India also, that when you start looking for the nation as a resolution and you become more nationalist in spirit. Now, nationalism is not a bad thing, but nationalism which looks for the enemy as the reason for your problems becomes problematic, because it's very easy to point fingers outside, point fingers at minorities within the country. But that's really no solution, because it's not them who are holding you back. It's you have to change. And so my part of the reason why I emphasize a back to the roots sort of approach is it seems to me we need to rediscover identity back in our communities. Now, when I say this to many sort of cosmopolitan people who dwell in big cities, they laugh. They say, we left those communities long back. But in the United Kingdom, 80% of people still identify with their village or their town as their community. I mean, they're not the rootless people that sometimes we see in cities. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing to be a citizen of everywhere, but there are many people who are a citizen of somewhere. And it seems to me that we need to, they need to find ways to address their problems, and we need to think about how that can best be done. And so some combination, this is why I say balance. It's not all the central government, it's not all the community, it's not all the markets, some balance between the three, which is going to help us get out of our problems. The fact that this is not just a United States problem, it's a problem in France, it's a problem in Germany, it's a problem in China, and it's a problem in India, suggests that we need a model for the world of the future. And that's, in a sense, what I'm trying to propose. At some level, some people are dissatisfied. Where is the big tax? Where is the big government program? These are all, milk toast. It's too light, but there is a big idea here, which is let us focus on decentralized government and governance as the way forward, rather than put yet more burden on a centralized government in a fractured society.
No, I love your kind of ending. I mean, I love how you describe the environment or the community in which certain things take place. And I think going to the original proper role of government was to essentially protect this environment. And that's where obviously the Scottish Enlightenment had so much influence on the founding fathers to develop the Constitution and develop really the environment in which commerce was to take place. And we've gone away from that, and it's understandable. At the same time, there's always a price to pay, and I think we're paying it right now just because of how people believe things should be. And I look at the future, and it's incredible what human beings have been able to create. The potential in one mind can change the world, and it can change a community. And that's where an environment where you essentially have handouts, or you have this theory that you should be taken care of. I don't know if it ever leads to a person really discovering happiness or fulfillment, which I think is kind of the general desire of everyone to an extent. And that's where it's like you look at you look at the examples that you cited, and whether it's Chicago or other places where people actually face adversity and figure out how to make adjustments and thrive because of that. So it's so inspiring. But it comes down to, really, I would say, the notion of forest and trees, right? Because a forest is an abstract. Forest doesn't exist, right? A community, right, is also kind of an abstract. It's a group of people, right? And I think the individual, right, and the protection of their rights is really due to what the individual can create in the right environment. If that's what the overall consensus is. And so that's where, I don't know, I look at your experience, and you obviously had a front row seat at the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, and you saw what happens and how decisions at high levels can impact the entire world, which it did. But also being a part of a higher education program at University of Chicago, and you coming to these conclusions isn't just you waking up in the morning and saying, hey, I'm going to write a book about this third pillar, right? That's why I find it fascinating, just how much you've experienced of where things succeed and where things fail. And I'm a fan, and I appreciate all the work that you've done. But I maybe a couple last questions. So where do you propose, like, your theories, like where have you tried to put them in front of, whether it's local bodies or federal bodies? I mean, what are you trying to achieve with this book, other than getting the ideas out there? Do you have some sort of an initiative that you're trying to push forward?
Well, I'm starting that process, and it starts first by publicizing the ideas, but then people start calling you and say, "Oh, come talk to us. We're doing this stuff." And I'm really learning more right now because there's so many different ways that communities are coping. So I got a call in the morning from a group at the World Bank, which is dealing with coal-dependent communities across the world, and how they are dealing with the fact that coal is now largely sort of on its way out. And how do they recover, and what kinds of different ways are different groups across the world doing it? And obviously, this is a very powerful sort of way if they figure out what sort of best practices are of trying to spread the word across the world. Here's how they have coped in Austria. Here's how they've coped in Australia. And therefore, let's figure out whether you can do some of these things. I think that's part of what I want to do is figure out how you can emphasize more of the success, make it happen more widely. Now, again, I do want to say that, part of this comes from my experience in development. I said I grew up thinking, why are we poor? And as I looked at development and I studied it, one of the most interesting findings in development is the very, very low explanatory power of aid flows from outside to how a country develops. So you would think a lot of money coming into the country from, countries giving money from across the world should make this country grow very fast. It doesn't.
Oh, yeah, Venezuela.
Well, for a variety of reasons, it has very low explanatory power. And so what really happens is when a country like South Korea says, we're going to make a change. And the development part for every country is different because each country has a different set of resources, different set of capabilities, different set of impediments. But it's when they figure out that they need to make a change, that is when the rest of the world can be helpful by buying their goods, by trading with them and so on. But that sort of idea has percolated into this book, that when you look at successful communities, again, we don't know what the recipe is because the recipe is something they figure out because they're close to the problem. But you do know that it often has to come from inside.
Well, thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing 45 minutes. I know we're a little over time, but I'm going to do my best. We're going to get the word out to our circle of influence, and I wish you the best. I mean, it's something that is a growing it's a growing challenge, and I think humanity is it's just fascinating to observe sometimes where we're at. And we've become essentially kind of a global community just because of the ease of communication. And sometimes ideas are where most of the power comes from. And getting an idea in a person's head and then getting it to get out of their head if it's the wrong idea or unprincipled idea, that's a big challenge. But I look at just intellectuals such as yourself and other just powers of influence, not necessarily from like a government central standpoint, but just whether it's media or authors that are rising to the challenge. I was at a financial conference a couple months ago up in Whistler, Canada, and Ray Dalio, right, obviously with Bridgewater and a just massive hedge fund, but the majority of his thoughts were directed toward taking some of his understanding of capitalism and free markets and so forth, and being able to institute that in central Connecticut to improve the poverty and crime situation there. So it's one of those things where I think that the problems are getting to the point where they're boiling over, and I think people like yourself are going to make a difference, are making and going to make a difference.
Thank you very much, and I do hope to stay engaged and hope we get more people to start thinking about these issues.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you again, Dr. Rajan. It's wonderful having you on, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you, and thanks for taking the time. Goodbye.
Bye.